So thank you for joining us. My name is John Janmat. I'm an associate professor of economics at the Okanagan campus of UBC. And I work in the area of water resources and environmental sustainability. I am the facilitator for this webinar today. Now, this is the first of 3 webinars that on agricultural water policy in a changing climate that are being presented by the University of British Columbia, Okanagan and the British Columbia Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network. So the sessions will be featuring an excellent lineup of speakers, 2 of whom will be sharing with you today. And if you miss any of the sessions, you'll be able to watch the live recording. Now, as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am hosting this session today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. We have people joining us from many places today, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands as well. So a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session includes 2 presenters, and we will have a question and answer break after each presenter. So before we get going, I'll cover a couple of these housekeeping notes. To ask questions, please use the Q&A box instead of the chat. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. Now, the chat gets a bit congested sometimes and it's hard to follow. So the Q&A will help us organize the questions. So, and using the Q&A box will allow you to enter your questions as you think of them and allow us to keep track of them more easily. And you can also upvote other people's questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. And that will help us to pick the questions that the audience is most interested in and deliver those to our guests. So for our first speaker, it is my pleasure to begin this session with Dr. Kiparsky. Michael Koparsky is the founding director of the Wheeler Water Institute within the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He has worked on technical and policy aspects of water resource management for 15 years and has experience in consulting, nonprofit, and agency settings. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Can we all see my slides?
Yeah, looks good.
Wonderful. So thanks all. I'll clue you all in to what I'm calling governance innovation under California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I would like to try and instigate doing this in a bit of an interactive way using the magic of Zoom. And part of that is because I know a little bit about Sigma, but I know nothing about British Columbia's Water Sustainability Act, which I think is part of the motivation for this series, or at least for inviting me to speak here. And so as I go through my remarks, I'd love to invite you to toss any observations in the chat in some format like this, simple structure of the similarities and differences that you might observe between what I'm telling you about Sigma and what you know about British Columbia's Water Sustainability Act. My hope here is to catalyze a better discussion, but also selfishly, I would like to learn a little bit more and see possibly if there's some opportunities for deeper engagement going forward. So I'll try, and I'm sure there's a way to harvest all of that information afterwards, and that would be useful for me, and maybe there's some follow-up that can happen from there. So Sigma, one of the most significant pieces of water legislation to come in California in the past century is 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So Sigma is historic legislation. It has the potential to bring California from among the most deficient of the US states in terms of their groundwater management into what I'm going to argue is a forward-looking, locally based scheme for trying to achieve sustainability in groundwater management. Sigma adopts a state policy of managing groundwater resources sustainably and defines sustainability as the avoidance of significant and unreasonable impacts to 6 undesirable results. Those results are a lowering of groundwater levels, reductions in groundwater storage, water quality impacts, seawater intrusion, subsidence, and impacts to interconnected surface waters. All of these impacts, as they're illustrated here, have occurred widely in California over the past century plus and continue to have material impacts and serious implications for the viability of human environmental uses of water in the state. All that is because California essentially had no statewide framework for California management before the implementation of Sigma. So Sigma's directive to avoid these unreasonable results is a sweeping prescription to a serious problem, but how exactly to go about it is what I'm concerning myself with here in these remarks about the governance. So to accomplish these objectives, Sigma gives central importance to the work of local entities that are called groundwater sustainability agencies. And these entities will do much of the work of implementing Sigma by developing, implementing, and updating groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs. Now, this map shows the Department of Water Resources prioritization of groundwater basins in the state. The yellow and orange basins are where GSAs have been required to self-organize and achieve sustainability over a timeline until 2040. So Sigma declares ambitious goals for the state, but major questions remain about how they'll actually achieve them. One of these major questions relates to the governance and institutional design around which Sigma is oriented. Sigma gives great local latitude, but it does not specify blueprints for the structure or the governance systems by which sustainability will be achieved. GSAs in general successfully organized themselves statewide by the 2017 deadline to do this. And recall, Sigma was passed in 2014 and went into effect in 2015. So that's pretty fast to generate a couple hundred new governmental entities in a single state. And a first tranche of their groundwater sustainability plans have been submitted and is currently under review by the California Department of Water Resources. These agencies will need to achieve sustainability by 2040 and beyond. So these are long-term changes in management and big challenges. And these challenges go against the inertia and momentum of over a century of groundwater mismanagement, or really lack of management, in most of the state. So for the rest of my remarks, I'll describe Sigma as an intriguing, and argue that it's an intriguing new model for distributed governance of groundwater. Let's see if that term will make any sense to you by the time I'm done. So Sigma has a unifying statutory core, but in progress, it's not a single policy or action or even a single approach. So I'll try to unpack for you what I mean by that by way of explaining this figure, which depicts what we're terming vertical, horizontal, and network governance processes that operate simultaneously in the implementation of Sigma. And I want to again acknowledge my colleague Anita Millman at the University of Massachusetts, who is really the creative force behind this work, but she bears no responsibility for my clumsiness in attempting to convey it to you here. So who acts and makes decisions in Sigma? First, local agencies that form GSAs are pre-existing public agencies, such as irrigation districts, and all of them are eligible to form GSAs either singly or come together in groups to do so. GSAs themselves are thus made up of one or more local agencies, and those GSAs are responsible for and empowered to meet Sigma's goals. So you've got these new set of local agencies that are overlaid on an existing fragmented patchwork of water management entities that also that already existed in California. Now, the state agencies include the California Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board in California, and they're responsible for things like oversight, enforcement, and technical support for GSAs. And then there's a raft of non-governmental participants, many types of stakeholders, and so forth. All of these will surface in the description of this cartoon. Now, the vertical dimension of Sigma governance is its primary governance process. That's a higher level of government requiring action by a lower level of government. In the United States, we have a cooperative federalism relationship between the federal and the state systems, and this is analogous to that just at the state level. In this case, the state of California has set requirements for groundwater sustainability, and it delegates authorities and responsibilities to local agencies to try and achieve those objectives. So the vertical governance under Sigma is local level implementation of a top-down mandate. Now, the Sigma statute and regulations are specific and directive, but they contain some ambiguity. So the state roles include some technical and financial support that's administered by the Department of Water Resources. Perhaps that's a carrot. But Sigma also mandates that the State Water Resources Control Board is the regulatory agency which can step in and take over management of basins from GSAs if they fail to achieve Sigma's goals. So you have correspondingly a stick in terms of State Water Board taking over these basins. Now, moving on to the second element of this governance triumvirate is the horizontal governance. The horizontal dimension of Sigma, as we conceive it, encompasses the institutional collective action that's emerged in GSA formation and GSP development and will continue through the life of the law. Institutional collective action is common in natural resources and in water, particularly because there's frequently a fragmented separation of jurisdictional responsibilities across agencies, which means that multiple agencies have control and impact on activities that affect shared resources and shared outcomes. And therefore, there needs to be some cooperation and again, collective action. The puzzle pieces in this figure are meant to reflect the fact that multiple GSAs typically exist and manage parts of each physically defined and interconnected groundwater basin. So some basins, some physical basins could have a single GSA managing them. Most of them have multiple existing entities that either have individually formed GSAs and thus must then cooperate, or have collectively come together to form GSAs and must cooperate. And regardless, they need to, because a single physical basin will be managed by multiple GSAs, they need to coordinate to ensure that the entire basin meets the sustainability guidelines. How that's working is to be determined, but in some cases, surprisingly well. So in a way, the devolution of authority to the local level is one of Sigma's greatest strengths and simultaneously one of its greatest weaknesses. In some basins, agencies that now need to work together have a history of collaboration. There have been other attempts to manage groundwater through voluntary development of management plans, integrated water resources management, and so forth. And so those relationships in some places are positive and already laid the groundwork for productive forward motion. In other basins, tensions are higher. There are histories of lawsuits and disagreements, or tensions resulting from differential access to surface water. So the governance of Sigma essentially is an unfolding experiment on this level about whether this kind of collective action can flourish and under what conditions. The third element here is that of network governance. The network governance dimension of Sigma encompasses the informal interactions among government and other private and public entities that each and collectively influence and reinforce actions that are meant to achieve sustainability. Now, these actions include dissemination of information, creating new norms or reinforcing existing ones, placing pressure for particular actions, coordination activities, and so forth. We have nonprofits, professional associations, think tanks, mediators and facilitators hired by the state and others, consultants, lawyers, and so forth. And each of these, in spite of not being a governmental entity, ultimately helps determine the outcomes for groundwater sustainability because they influence both the capacity and decision-making of the GSAs themselves. So, in a sense, this network helps to augment the as yet untested enforcement roles as well in this vertical governance by the state. And this is important because by definition, GSAs are making all of this up as they go along, right? This simply hasn't been done before. Now, the list of how this network governance works is long, but it's fair to say that Sigma implementation has in essence created a bit of a cottage industry that stretches far beyond the narrow confines of the 200 some odd GSAs themselves, or even beyond the confines of government more generally. So 3 implications from this conception of Sigma's model. First, although Sigma is a single set of legislative acts, it creates implementation with multiple moving parts, and we're arguing that they need to be viewed holistically if we're to understand Sigma's potential and also its novelty. Second, we should emphasize that this structure reflects the fact that Sigma's authors found a politically palatable approach through which the state could take action to address its groundwater problem in the face of considerable resistance to regulation. Now, one can't imagine, in fact, it's very easy to imagine a more centralized or linear governance structure, but that was rightly seen as a non-starter by Sigma's architects from a political perspective. The enticement of the potential for local control, combined with the support engendered by an epic drought, enabled Sigma's passage, and with it, this governance experiment in a locally motivated, locally tailored approach that holds the additional possibility of being a generator for innovation. And you can ask me about that as another pet topic of mine, if you like. The third piece is for practitioners who might be viewing Sigma as a potential model for governance schemes in other areas outside of California. It's important to recognize that Sigma's elements are interconnected and mutually reinforcing by necessity and by design. So any partial analog of Sigma's model as we describe it would be difficult to port to other areas without careful examination of the potential gaps that might result with consequences for governance. Now, to be clear, I don't necessarily recommend adopting Sigma if simpler models are available and feasible, but its advantages could include political tractability, because groundwater is something people often are motivated to fight about, and this potential for local innovation and refinement in concepts. That's something that might be worth considering in some places. All right, so I'll check the chat, and I hope that that some of you were able to contribute some of these little dichotomies here. And ultimately, I would be curious in seeing a complete version of this table that I started in my ignorance to mock up earlier, and to hear some of your insights in the questions. So thank you very much. Some further reading, some further reading if you want it, and I have an infinite number of resources on this very well-studied system.
Thank you, Michael. Definitely an interesting contrast with what we're doing here in BC. Now, there's people on who know more than I, but one of the contrasts I think that stands out is in our Water Sustainability Act, there has been, I'd say, a great reluctance to delegate and trust local authorities. And a lot of the control has remained at the level of Victoria. You gave, I guess, some sense that it's still a work in progress, but are you pretty optimistic or not that these GSAs are going to figure out how to achieve those goals?
My guess is that it will vary as far as the effectiveness. When push comes to shove, we're entering another drought. Groundwater is an extraordinary, it's a resource that the state has depended on in addition to surface water for its entire existence. And the amount of reductions in extraction and use of water is immense, and substitutes are being sought in the form of creative ways to capture water for recharge and so forth. But the numbers don't really add up. So there will be some pain felt by water users, and whether the law survives the resistance that's inevitably going to arise from short-termism remains to be seen. But when it boils down to it, Sigma has to work, because as I see it, there really isn't another option aside beyond crippling California's water and environmental systems.
Okay. Well, I've got a couple of questions in the chat right now. And one of them, which I think you kind of answered, but perhaps repeating a bit would help with a few people. So the first is, for the purpose of GSA formation, what is included in local agencies in addition to irrigation districts? Like what, again, might be some examples of various entities or agencies that would become part of a GSA?
Yeah, those irrigation districts, county governments can be part of GSA formations and have a role. California's water management sector is one that's extraordinarily fragmented, and so it's a large patchwork of entities, and they can join together in a number of different ways through MOUs or memoranda of understanding, and joint powers authorities and so forth. But this patchwork provides sort of a target-rich environment, and many have sort of argued about many agencies that have enjoyed some authority over a part of the water management sphere have been reluctant to give up that power. And so what that's resulted in is this patchwork at multiple scales, both within physical basins and physically defined groundwater basins, and within the GSAs themselves, where multiple agencies have come together and need to figure out ways to cooperate. So the governance from the beginning is not as one might design for simplicity, but as one might design for political expediency, and on a positive note for leveraging existing expertise, because water management entities that already had responsibility had capacity to understand water systems and manage them that would have been difficult to make from whole cloth.
Okay. I've got a couple questions on the connection between groundwater and surface water. So the reforms to our Water Sustainability Act brought down groundwater in and things as one water, whereas prior to that, it was kind of a Wild West rule of capture type of thing for groundwater. In California legislation, what is the connection between groundwater and surface from a legal point of view?
It's a great question. So the first way to answer that is the legal history. California has lived under the legal fiction that groundwater and surface water are two separate things for its entire history. And yet, so Sigma opens the door in probably a soft way towards acknowledging that interconnection, and it does so by saying that Sigma's activities, well, number one, they don't alter existing legal water rights regimes, and so that is a challenge in and of itself when you're trying to change management. But Sigma does specify that its activities can't, or that activities of GSAs to achieve sustainability need to avoid harming need to avoid generating impacts to interconnected surface waters. Now, that has a couple of implications. One is there needs to be the avoiding of impacts to downstream water users that have water rights to surface water. So that ties the connection together to a certain point between the groundwater and the surface water. And the second is the acknowledgement in regulation of the importance of groundwater dependent ecosystems. This includes not only fisheries, but also things like vernal pools and seeps and springs and wetlands that can at times be groundwater fed. All of these are relevant only in the Sigma context, are relevant only insofar as there exists or existed a connection between the groundwater and the surface water systems on the date that Sigma went into effect in 2015. So Sigma does not require GSAs to reverse the century of groundwater declines over the course of its life, only that they use that 2015 point as a baseline that they cannot get worse than. So that that limits the relevance of Sigma for reconnecting groundwater and surface water systems where you have groundwater and surface water systems that are disconnected by previous impacts to pumping.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. There are still a couple of questions, but we should really be moving on to our next guest today. So I will introduce our next speaker. This is Dr. Medellín-Azuara, and I hope I didn't destroy that too much. So Dr. Medellín is an associate professor in the School of Engineering at the University of California, Merced. He's also an associate director of the University of California Davis Center for Watershed Sciences and UC Agricultural Issues Center, and an adjunct research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. He has worked as an advisor, consultant, and collaborator for numerous NGOs, as well as agriculture and water agencies. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, I've been having some video in the past few hours, some video issues. I'm very glad that my colleague Mike just provided an amazing overview of all the legal aspects of SGMA. So I don't have to cover with my very limited understanding of it. So first of all, water resources in California. So I'll talk mostly on the economic and hydroeconomic modeling aspects of this, with some also some thoughts for policy and management. So water resources in California, north part is wet, is this blue portion of the map, and the reddish part.
Your slide has not advanced on my screen, at least.
Okay, let me just try again.
So while Josué is reconnecting here, perhaps one more question for Michael. In the Q&A, people are interested in agriculture. One specific question was, how were agriculture folks included? And the second was, how good was the consultation between stakeholders, which I would expect also agriculture was specifically thought of in that context.
Well, depending on which point in the process you're talking about, the engagement before the passage of the law was intense and involved a tremendous amount of lobbying, but also crafting the legislation such that it could be politically palatable. To that extent, agriculture was certainly a part, as perhaps the most affected sector of the economy by SGMA. And to what extent is agriculture currently consulted? Well, intensively. By and large, GSAs are built upon organizations that supply water primarily to agricultural entities. And as such, their representation on boards of directors and so forth is quite substantial and ongoingly so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So maybe we've got it working now.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So sorry, thanks for the patience. As I said, most of the areas, the wet areas are in the north and in the Sierras, and that's where most of the water supply lives, and in a regular year. And but the demand occurs in the summer and in a pretty and in the reddish areas that are in south of the Central Valley, and also on the coastal, the heavily populated cities in the coast. So we have a very engineered system, like many other developed countries in the world, that can move water and store water from all the way north from Shasta right here, and even can send through some sort of connection to Mexico here in San Diego. There's an emergency connection between Tijuana and San Diego that from time to time is used. So we have droughts, and these are just shows you some pictures, and we have also floods, and we have this what is called a whiplash of climate events, that in which we have a set of very dry years, and then they are followed by extremely wet years. And this has been subject of many researchers recently, including Dr. Swain and others. So, where are we now? So we are right now in, this is a week old or something. We're in the wettest part of the state, usually in the north, as you saw in the initial map. We are 23.1%. So this is a pretty dry year, critically dry, not the driest, but it's on the top high for all three major basins, which are the San Joaquin Basin. I will do some pointing here. So some laser pointer here. So this is the Sacramento River Basin. This is the San Joaquin River Basin and the Tulare Lake Basin. These ones being dry.
I need to advance again. Right now I see whiplash weather in California. Anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll pass them along.
I can answer one that I'm starting to type, and which came in the chat to me, which says, please, in simple words, what is the water budget model for example, net recharge or net depletion? The answer to that is that SGMA legislation implies, but if I recall correctly, does not specify a water balance model, any particular one that's used, or even that a water balance model needs to be used. What it does specify is that the achievement of sustainability is defined by the avoidance of these impacts, the lowering of groundwater levels, impacts to water quality, seawater intrusion, and so forth. So how a GSA does that is up to that GSA. Now, there is ultimately, in order to make decisions around how water is used and what the role of recharge might be and so forth, a water balance model is almost necessarily part of a technical attempt at answering those questions, the how questions, and the details of what that model looks like, A, are partly up to the GSA. B, the last time I checked, which wasn't unfortunately that recently, so Josué may be able to answer this question more precisely, but each of the major agencies that I mentioned in the State Water Resources Control Board and the Department of Water Resources, was involved in developing its own water balance model for this application, and no single one had been arrived at yet. Like I said, Josué may know better if that has been reconciled yet, but point is that's not the core methodology for SGMA.
Thank you, Mike, for covering. Yes, so, okay, so this is just continuing with this, and I will just jump to the main points in a minute or two. So these are current conditions. This is 2019-21. You can see them on the left, on the right bottom. Also, the stream flows are pretty low. So if you could put the next slide. So the next slide, please. Yeah. So what have we learned from agriculture and surrounding communities? And the next map has some sort of animation. So, but I'm not sure if it will have to go into presentation mode. But point being, there is agriculture is big. It's a large stakeholder during droughts, and yeah, perfect. And it has a high value among the top, if not the top, in the United States in many things. So if you can click next, please. So, but has some challenges, including hardening of demand due to permanent crops, which are increasing in area, but also provide most of the revenues for the state. So next one, please. And this shows you like an animation of how we have been converted in one of the most overdrafted areas in the Central Valley into permanent crops. Next, please. In the latest drought, you can see on the red bars, those are reductions or estimated reductions in surface water supply during a drought. And the blue bars show on the left what is the replacement that occurred with groundwater. So the map on the right shows you like different degrees of pumping that occurred to compensate for these surface losses, which heightened the role of groundwater in agriculture to cope with droughts. Next one, please. So this is kind of a summary of impacts of drought. We lost about half of the surface water in the deepest year in the most recent drought. And we increased pumping by 70%, but we only had like a 2.5, or like a 6% reduction in the regular crop revenues, which is not much for a drought of this magnitude, if you think about it. Next one, please. So also we saw a lot of problems with dry wells in the disadvantaged communities and higher concentration of pollutants, which is, as Mike said, one of the undesirable effects during Sigma. So next one, please. So, oh, that's my animation. Thank you. So, so there was a lot of assistance to communities that face deep pockets of unemployment in the valley. So the emergency came with them, services came with assistance from various forms, and that was one thing that was implemented in the past drought, and is in this one too. Next one, please. So some lessons. So if you could click next, please. So droughts focus attention and encourage improvement that catalyze Sigma in many regards. A diversified economy had helped to cope with drought. Major drought and climate change have a much less impact on irrigated water, which has diversified supplies, and also small rural communities suffer the most during droughts. Next one, please. So what this map is seen by many. Maybe is the overdraft, the bulletin 118, which is the groundwater basins that Mike described, and shows some of the critically overdrafted basins. And I won't go to all the process that Michael covered in a very good detail, but essentially we need to achieve sustainability. Next one, please. And we have a pervasive overdraft of about 1.8 million acre foot, about 2.2, 2.3 billion cubic meters per year, especially in the San Joaquin Valley. And if we want to implement Sigma, if you click to the next one, please. We realized in doing water balances that about 11% of all the applied water to agriculture is attributed to overdraft. It's essentially just mining the large aquifer. Next one, please. So if we were to implement Sigma by 2040, these will be the approximate reductions in applied water that will have to happen in this part of the valley, which is the San Joaquin Valley, in order to achieve sustainability and buffer enough water to cope with dry years when it's needed and be able to pump. Next one, please. So we estimated using economic models what could be the crop revenue losses, employment, and things, so that we can plan ahead and elicit promising water management alternatives. So the first bar shows you what it will happen if you cut everyone the same. Just don't have any markets, any trading, and just say the higher value and the lower value communities should be cut the same to achieve sustainability. Well, we will expect higher crop revenue losses. However, if you allow internal trades of water, this cost can be substantially reduced. The irrigated area reductions won't be as improved a lot with that. It's just a mass balance thing. However, the revenue losses will be. Next, click next, please. So we also have water, if we have some interregional trading of water, which is has a lot of legislative or legislative or legal hurdles, as Mike can describe. We can also cut back a little bit more the revenue losses, but not much more the land following that will have to occur. And this is permanent land following or land repurposing. And the last one, if you click next, please, is what it will happen if you do some supply augmentation, and what could it happen to the this in the valley, and what will be the costs. Okay, so last one, please. So this is kind of a summary of what we could see in terms of impacts, revenue losses, GDP losses, and job losses under all of these alternatives, with local trading, surface water trading among districts, and supply augmentation. So last one, please. So I think this is the last one. So Sigma has brought challenges of enforced creativity and hopefully cooperation among agencies and of water. Hydroeconomic models can be helpful in eliciting some of these costs and areas that may need some work. And demand management increases the flexibility allocation in the allocation of water can dampen some of the economic costs of achieving sustainability. And lastly, supply management action can vary widely in cost, so we will have to see who can afford for those. And with that, I think I have my final slide, and again, apologies for the technical issues. So thanks for to a lot of colleagues and to my research lab that makes me look productive.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes yet before the end of the hour. And so first question I've got here, which I think both of you might be able to provide a little bit of answer, is does California still rely on a system of prior appropriation? And if so, which users typically have the senior rights?
I think that is Mike's question. I will just say, all I know that there is a pre-1914 water rights and riparian water rights, Pueblo rights. So Mike, perhaps you wanna dive into that one.
California has a mixed doctrine system. So as Josué mentioned, there is coexistence among a number of doctrines, including riparian users. So if you own land next to a river or stream, you can take as much water for reasonable beneficial uses on that parcel as you like, as you're able to. There's a prior appropriation system that exists sometimes uncomfortably alongside that, in which senior or in which water is allocated by seniority. I'll mention, because we're talking about groundwater today, that there is also groundwater rights law that has several different slices to it, one of which is related to the ability of overlaying landowners to use as much water as they reasonably and beneficially can on their land. Now, we can embark on a deep discussion with someone more knowledgeable than myself, ideally, about this. But to the particular point of the question, what that means is that senior surface water rights holders tend to be agricultural because the state was originally settled and the early water use was primarily agricultural. So most urban users are junior and thus have a harder time, or urban users are junior enough that they don't have surface water rights to speak of and thus rely on groundwater. Now, because we have these separate doctrines for groundwater and surface water, the control of these two, there's sometimes an uneasiness about how to manage the system as a whole, given that people like Josué recognize the interconnectedness of the two systems, but people who sit in my department in the law school, and I confess I'm not an attorney, they can read the law, which says there isn't a relationship between the two. So Sigma's trying to bring these disconnects together. We'll see how well it does.
Oh, a couple other questions relate to water trading and water markets. So to begin with, what is a water market? How does, if it's possible to answer in a couple minutes, what does water trading look like? And how free is it? And what is the potential for hoarding or otherwise making it hard for some people who really need water to get water?
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly on the economic side. Well, decades of literature show that it makes sense. So why is not adopted? And it's in part because there's a lot of institutional and other hurdles that need to be overcome in order to make it happen. So it happens widely within a district, within a irrigation district, but moving water from one county or certain boundaries to another is not out of challenges. And even in a highly interconnected system as California that has the ability to move water all around the state, this does not happen easily and timely. So Mike has also worked on groundwater markets and other things. Perhaps you might want to comment on that as well.
Josué gets it right, of course, on groundwater markets. And I think one of the questions is not, there are a number of ways in which markets and markets-based mechanisms can be deployed. One would be a cap and trade model where GSA does its water balance, figures out what the collective water use can be in order to meet its need for sustainability, allocates that in some way across existing and potential water users, and then allows them, meters their use, and then allows them to trade the rights to extract water among themselves. And so that type of water market has been proposed and is being implemented in places. And it will be fascinating because the devil lies in the details in terms of everything from how does the environment play in a water market when the fish don't have a checkbook, and to how disadvantaged communities might be impacted by water markets that can have unintended consequences, like distributing pumping hotspots in one place or another, where people might not have access to the same depth of wells as agriculture does. So they're fascinating questions, and I can refer you to a report called Trading Sustainability from 2017 for more details on how that could play out. And there are a lot of other interesting examples of very thoughtful implementation that are being put in place since then.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're down to the last minute. Question at the end here is interesting idea on water trading. Will be challenging for existing water rights holders. Who benefits most from water trading? Is it the senior rights holders or the junior rights holders?
I could. I mean, the higher value commodities will usually benefit more. They have a higher willingness to pay for water when it comes to shortage, and well, that is supposedly even out, yes, right? But it is not, and it has oftentimes some unintended effects on the environment. So one of the proposals or the ideas was to try to incentivize low environmental impact water trades. This time around in the drought, much more attention is being paid to communities that are vulnerable to get dry wells. So sometimes.
I would add to that by arguing that it really depends on the design of the market system.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned allocation. So how the initial rights to use water, the tradable rights to use water are initially apportioned is a decision that would have to be made at the level of the GSA, because it's not baked into water rights law in California. That is one sort of initial condition that will determine who gains, who loses, and how from water. Externalities that might be generated also play into who gains and who might lose, including potentially the environment or disadvantaged communities and so forth. So in my view, this is a question that can be answered at the surface level through an economics modeling exercise, but an economics modeling exercise that is too simplistic may actually lose the reality that might manifest ultimately from implementation of a program without really careful forethought. And so that argues for the design of these market trading programs being a real key determinant of the answer to the question that you're asking about who wins and who loses. One more thing that really is important to note here is that the distribution of the benefits and costs of markets matters so deeply, in part because Sigma is layered on top of an unclear system for groundwater rights law. So a groundwater trading program, in essence, depends on the uniform buy-in of all the participants and all the stakeholders who have a stake in the basin, because it's not enshrined in law in the groundwater rights law itself. So there's nothing aside from the uniform buy-in and benefits being distributed enough to keep everybody happy that will keep people from exiting the market and potentially exiting the restrictions that enable the market and pumping water for themselves in a way that could undermine the market system itself. So these are there's an economics view of the answer to your question, and there's an institutional determinant of the real answer to the question. And we really don't know how it's going to play out, but Josué and I are both, I hope I can speak for him on this, really excited to see how it's realized and hopefully be able to contribute some analysis that ends up with durable outcomes and ultimately then a successful Sigma.
Maybe the last question now would be mine, building on that. So within these GSAs, groundwater is still not clearly defined rights-wise. So here in BC, we've got this big challenge right now to register all these groundwater wells and license them. And those licenses will have quantitative amounts and seniorities, and that will then integrate it into the overall system of water rights. So I kind of got from some of the conversations that it's the GSAs themselves that'll be figuring out this allocation of groundwater. And so it's not like a state level licensed system.
That is correct. And it's correct that there is some ambiguity and that there's a difference between GSA's decisions and ultimately the legal water rights. The legal basis for Sigma, I believe, has at least part to do with the requirement in California water rights law that water be used reasonably for beneficial purposes. And it's that reasonableness that is a subjective part of water rights law, rather than something that's enshrined in a quantitative way, or even that's allocated based on more classical or more foundational parts of water rights law. So it's in everybody's interests to make Sigma work in a way that's broadly positive, because the conflicts that result from trying to narrow down and certainly fight out water rights disputes in the courts in California last on decadal timescales, and we really don't have that kind of time to get clarity. So there's pressure to figure things out amicably and in ways that keep stakeholders happy. When you're talking about limiting a foundational resource that underlies the economic existence of entire regions, that's an easier thing to say than do, and that's why there's so much emphasis from all these groups in the network governance space that are not governmental or not water users, so much emphasis in trying to support the successful implementation of Sigma.
Okay, well, once again, I'll repeat my thanks, and now as well for the extra time you've both given to continue. And clearly you've engaged the audience, because a substantial number of people actually stayed on as well. So I can do my own personal applause here. And once again, thanks for the time. Thanks for all of those who attended, and we'll see some of you next week. Bye.
Thank you all
very much.
Feel free to reach out with follow-ups if you like. Happy to
Okay.
engage.
Likewise. Take care.
Take care.